The year was 1886, and the air over the eastern Colorado Territory already carried the hard, crystalline edge of the winter to come. Elspeth Corrigan felt it in her bones, a familiar ache that spoke of thinning blood and the deep, relentless cold that would soon clamp down upon the high plains. She stood on the property her family had so grudgingly allotted her after Thomas's passing, a parcel of land considered the dregs of their holdings. It was a place of inconvenient slopes and wind-scoured rock, dominated by a steep, stony hill that faced due north, perpetually in its own shadow. To her brothers, it was pasture land at best, a place fit for a goat or a widow, and they made little distinction between the two. But Elspeth was not looking at the poor soil or the lack of good timber. She was looking at the hill itself, her gaze tracing a line just above its base, her mind's eye peeling back the coarse turf and layers of shale. While her neighbors were chinking the logs of their cabins and splitting the last of their cordwood, Elspeth was sharpening the tip of a shovel, its steel worn thin from a lifetime of use. She was going to dig. Not for a root cellar, not for a well, but for a home. Her two children, young Samuel and little Maeve, watched from the doorway of their flimsy, hastily erected cabin, a structure that felt more like a sieve for the wind than a shelter against it. They saw their mother, a woman made of quiet resolve and sinew, drive the shovel into the unyielding earth at the base of the great, shadowed hill. The sound was a dull thud, an act of defiance against the land itself. It was this sound, this sight of a lone woman digging into the north face of a useless hill, that first drew the attention of Amos Kelleher as he drove his wagon along the rutted track that passed for a road. He reined in his horses, the steam pluming from their nostrils in the crisp air, and watched for a long moment. It was an act of such profound foolishness, in his estimation, that it bordered on madness. A woman alone, with winter breathing down her neck, wasting her strength on a hole in the ground. He shook his head, a gesture of pity mixed with a certain grim satisfaction that his own preparations were so much more sensible, so much more aligned with the established wisdom of the territory. Amos did not keep his observations to himself. Within a week, the news of the widow Corrigan's folly had circulated through the sparse community of homesteaders. His wife, Dora, spoke of it in hushed, concerned tones over the fence to Constance Hartwell, suggesting Elspeth's grief had finally unsettled her mind. The men who gathered at the small trading post discussed it with a kind of detached amusement, a welcome distraction from the anxieties of their own winter stores. They pitied her, of course, but pity was a safer position than attempting to understand. They saw a woman digging a grave and preparing to move her children into it. The conventional wisdom was clear and unassailable. You built a house to stand up in the sun, to catch its warmth and light. You built a root cellar, deep and separate, a place for things to be preserved in the cold, not a place for people to live. To dig into a north-facing slope, the coldest, darkest, most frost-prone aspect of any piece of land, was to invite the damp and the deep freeze directly into your home. It was a rejection of every lesson the harsh land had taught them. Amos Kelleher, being a man who considered himself both practical and neighborly, felt it his duty to intervene. He found Elspeth several days later, her face smudged with dirt and her hands raw, a growing pile of shale and rocky soil beside a dark opening in the hillside. "Mistress Corrigan," he began, his voice laced with the unearned authority of a man who has never been wrong about practical matters. "Winter is a hard teacher. There is still time to reinforce your cabin. I have some spare timber I could part with." He gestured vaguely toward her existing shelter. He was not an unkind man, but his kindness was predicated on the assumption of his own superior knowledge. He saw her labor not as a project, but as a symptom of desperation and poor judgment. He was offering a cure for her foolishness, a return to the sensible path. Elspeth paused, resting her hands on the worn handle of the shovel. She looked at Amos, at his sturdy frame and his confident, pitying eyes, and she understood that explaining her purpose would be as futile as trying to plant corn in the frozen ground. "The cabin will not hold against the wind, Mr. Kelleher," she said, her voice even and calm. "And it consumes wood faster than a furnace. This," she nodded toward the hole, "will be different." Amos squinted at the dark opening. "Different? It will be a tomb. The frost will drive 6 feet into that north face. The damp will sicken your children. The earth will settle and crush you in your sleep. It is a desperate gamble against every known thing." His objections were logical, built upon the shared experience of every man and woman who had ever tried to survive a winter on that unforgiving prairie. They were the very same objections she had considered and dismissed weeks ago. She tried once to explain the principle. "The deep earth is not frozen," she stated simply. "Below the frost line, the ground holds a steady heart. It is cool, but it is not the killing cold of the air. The north side is shielded from the sun, so the ground does not heave with the freezing and thawing. It is stable. It is a constant." Amos simply shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. He saw her words as poetry, the fanciful ramblings of a woman unmoored from reality. He had dug cellars and post holes his entire life. He knew about the frost line. But the idea of harnessing the Earth's deep temperature, of living within it, was alien. Watching an outcome was not the same as understanding the principle. He knew a cellar kept vegetables from freezing, but he believed it was the simple fact of being underground, away from the wind, that did the work. He did not comprehend the science of it, the vast thermal battery that lay beneath his feet. He saw Earth as a dead thing to be dug in, not a living system to be partnered with. Elspeth did not argue further. She had learned long ago from her father that you could not pour knowledge into a vessel that was already full of certainty. Her father had been a well digger and a stonemason, a man who spent his life reading the language of soil and rock. He was not a farmer who looked at the surface of the land, but a man who understood its depths. He had taught her that most people feared the earth, seeing it only as a source of dirt and a final resting place. But he had seen it as a blanket, a great, warm-blooded animal that slept through winter. "The earth has a slow pulse, Elspeth," he used to tell her, his hands caked with the clay of a freshly dug well. "In the summer, it soaks up the heat of the sun deep into its bones. In the winter, it breathes that warmth back out ever so slowly. A man who builds his house up in the wind is a fool when he could be tucked in the earth's pocket, safe and warm." He had built such a place once, a winter workshop for his masonry, dug into the side of a granite hill back in the old country. The other masons had mocked him, calling it his burrow. But when the winter gales came, their own workshops were frozen, their mortar buckets solid ice, their fingers too numb to hold a chisel. Her father, meanwhile, worked steadily in the still, cool air of his subterranean room, warmed by a single small brazier that seemed to burn with impossible efficiency. He had explained it to her with the patient clarity of a master craftsman. The stone walls, he said, were not just holding back the dirt. They were drinking the earth's heat. The flue for his brazier did not just go up. It first went down, deep into the ground, pulling in air that was already tempered by the earth, not the frigid air from outside. It was a closed, stable system. He called it breathing with the land. And as Elspeth dug, each shovelful of soil, each pry of the crowbar against a stubborn rock, was an act of remembering, a conversation with her father's ghost. The work was brutal, a relentless physical trial that stretched over weeks. She began by excavating a wide, deep trench into the hillside, about 10 feet high and 20 feet across. The topsoil gave way to dense clay, and then to layers of shale that had to be broken apart with a pickaxe and a heavy sledge. Her hands, already calloused, blistered and bled, and then hardened into thick pads of leather. She worked from dawn until the light failed, her muscles screaming in protest each morning, her body fueled by little more than tea, bread, and a furious, quiet determination. The children learned to play near the dig site, Maeve making little houses from chips of shale, while Samuel, old enough to feel the weight of their situation, helped by clearing the smaller stones, his face a mask of serious concentration. He was his mother's silent partner in this strange and desperate enterprise. Once the initial excavation was complete, the true craft began. She needed to line the entire space, walls and ceiling, to prevent collapse and to manage the inevitable dampness. For this, she turned to the other resource her brothers had deemed worthless: the endless, scattered field stones that littered the property. She and Samuel spent days gathering them with a wheelbarrow, sorting them by size and shape. She was looking for flat, stable stones for the foundation courses, and long, strong ones to serve as lintels. It was the work of a stonemason, a trade she had learned by watching her father, absorbing the geometry and physics of it through observation. She did not have mortar, not in any real quantity, so she would have to dry stack the walls, a far more difficult art. It required a precise eye, an intuitive understanding of balance and friction, of how each stone must lock into its neighbors, transferring its load down and out. She laid the first course deep and wide, using the largest, flattest stones she could find. Then, course by course, the walls began to rise. It was a slow, three-dimensional puzzle. She would select a stone, feel its weight and balance in her hands, turn it over and over, and then fit it into place. A smaller stone might be needed to chink a gap, a thin piece of slate to act as a shim, leveling the next course. Behind the rising stone walls, she packed a thick layer of the densest clay she had excavated, pounding it into place with the end of a log. This clay barrier, as her father had taught her, was the secret to managing moisture. It was nearly waterproof, and it would draw any penetrating dampness downward, away from the interior space, into a gravel-filled trench she had dug along the base of the foundation. The community saw a woman piling rocks in a hole. Elspeth was building a breathable, stable membrane between her family and the raw earth. The roof was the most dangerous part of the construction. She had salvaged heavy timbers from a collapsed barn on a neighboring, abandoned homestead, hauling them one by one on a makeshift travois. Laying these massive beams across the top of her stone walls was a feat of leverage and sheer willpower. She used a long pole as a lever and piles of rocks as a fulcrum, inching each beam up and into place, her heart pounding with the effort and the risk. Once the beams were set, she laid a thick layer of smaller poles across them, followed by heavy canvas tarps she had waterproofed with pine tar. On top of this, she carefully replaced the sod and soil she had first excavated, packing it down until the roof of her dwelling blended almost seamlessly back into the hillside. From a distance, it looked as if the earth had simply swallowed her work, leaving only a dark doorway and a single stone chimney pipe sticking out of the ground. That chimney was the final piece of her father's design. It was not a conventional chimney. She built it from flat stones, forming a square flue that, instead of rising directly from the firebox, first ran horizontally for 10 feet, deep into the earth at the back of the dwelling. Only then did it turn upward, venting out through the sod roof. This earth flue, as her father had called it, was a heat exchanger. The hot smoke from even a small fire would warm the massive stone channel, and that heat would radiate slowly back out, not into the outside air, but into the deep earth and the stone walls of the room, turning the entire structure into a gentle, efficient radiator. It was a design of profound elegance and simplicity, but to her neighbors, who saw only a stovepipe emerging from the dirt, it was the final confirmation of her madness. A fire built in the ground, they whispered, was an invitation to disaster. By the time the first snows came in late October, Elspeth and the children had moved in. The interior was a single large room, stark and troglodytic, but it was hers. A heavy wooden door, braced and insulated with packed wool, sealed the entrance. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of earth, stone, and curing wood. It was utterly silent. The relentless prairie wind that had tormented them in the cabin, now a distant, irrelevant hum. She had built simple bunks against one wall, a sturdy table in the center, and at the far end, the small iron stove that was the heart of the home, its flue disappearing into the stone wall behind it. The back third of the space, farther from the stove, was her cellar, where barrels of potatoes, carrots, and salted meat rested on stone shelves, protected from both freezing and rot by the constant, deep earth chill. She had not just built a shelter, she had built a complete system for survival. The first true test arrived with the new year. A blizzard, born in the far north, descended upon the plains with a fury that stunned even the oldest settlers. It was not just a storm, it was a physical assault. The wind, a solid wall of ice and snow, screamed for days on end, erasing the horizon and burying fences, sheds, and entire wagons in monumental drifts. The temperature plummeted to a point where the very air seemed to crackle and splinter. In the scattered cabins across the territory, families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly with precious wood. The wind found every crack, every chink in the log walls, driving fine, sharp snow into the rooms and sucking the heat out as fast as it could be generated. The world was reduced to the howling of the wind and the desperate, ongoing battle to stay warm. In Elspeth's hill house, there was only a profound and unshakable quiet. The fury of the blizzard was a distant rumor, a faint, high-pitched whine that could barely be heard above the gentle hiss of the small fire in her stove. The temperature in the room held at a steady, comfortable level, cool enough for a sweater, but warm enough for Maeve to play on the floor without a chill. The stone walls, saturated with the earth's latent warmth, radiated a gentle, even heat. She fed the stove only a few small logs every few hours, an impossibly small amount of fuel for such a brutal cold. Her wood pile, which her neighbors had declared woefully inadequate for the winter, would now last her until spring, and perhaps beyond. She spent the days of the blizzard in a state of calm industry, mending clothes, reading to the children, and checking her provisions. There was no fear, no desperate struggle. There was only the quiet hum of a system working in perfect harmony with the world outside. She had placed her faith not in thick walls to fight the cold, but in a principle that simply ignored it. For 6 days, the storm raged. On the 7th day, the wind finally lessened, though the snow continued to fall, thick and silent. It was in this gray, muffled world that a figure appeared, floundering through the massive drifts toward her door. It was Amos Kelleher. His face was gaunt, his beard encrusted with ice. He did not knock so much as slump against the heavy door. When Elspeth opened it, He nearly fell inside, bringing with him a blast of frigid air that felt alien and violent in the stillness of her home. He stared around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected a frozen, damp hovel, a place of misery and desperate cold. Instead, he saw two children playing quietly on a rug, their faces healthy and untroubled. He felt not a wave of heat, as from an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls, the floor, the air itself. It was the most profound and comforting warmth he had ever felt. "My boy is sick," he said, his voice raspy. "A fever. And my wife, she is exhausted. We are burning the last of our wood. The house, the snow is coming through the walls. We cannot keep it warm." He looked at Elspeth, and for the first time, she saw no pity in his eyes, no certainty, only a raw and humbled desperation. He was a man whose entire understanding of the world had been shattered by the quiet reality of this room. His practical knowledge, his traditions, his entire framework for survival had failed him. He was standing in the middle of his own foolishness, and it was warm and safe and smelled of baking bread. Elspeth had a loaf in her small oven, a simple luxury that must have seemed like an impossible miracle to him. She felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet affirmation. The sensory proof was absolute. It was in the feel of the still, warm air on Amos's frozen skin. It was in the sight of her children, safe and sound. It was in the earthy smell of the potatoes in the cellar, which she knew were still firm and crisp, unlike his, which would be on the verge of freezing or rotting in his less stable, above-ground cellar. She remembered her father's words. "Listen to the stone and the soil, Elspeth. They speak a slower, wiser language than men do." In that moment, the success was not that she had been right and Amos had been wrong. The success was the warmth itself, the quiet, the safety. The principle had held. The earth had kept its promise. Without a word, she wrapped the fresh loaf of bread in a cloth, filled a sack with potatoes and carrots from her cellar stores, and handed it to him. She also gave him a bundle of kindling and a few precious, slow-burning logs. It was not charity. It was an offering from a place of abundance to a place of want. Amos took the supplies, his gaze still sweeping across the impossible room. He looked at the neatly stacked stones of the walls, the massive ceiling beams, the small, quiet stove. He was a practical man, and his mind was working, deconstructing what he saw, trying to reconcile it with what he had so firmly believed. He was beginning to understand that this was not a grave, it was a womb. I was wrong, he said, the words costing him a great deal. It was a plain and unadorned admission, but in the understated language of the frontier, it was a profound apology and a testament to her success. "I did not understand. I thought you were digging out of grief, but this is wisdom." He looked at the flue disappearing into the back wall. How? It was a simple question, but it held a universe of meaning. It was the question of a student, not a critic. The transfer of knowledge had begun. Elspeth did not deliver a lecture. She simply replied, "The earth holds its own heat. You just have to know how to ask for it." When the blizzard finally broke and the community emerged to dig itself out, the story of Amos Kelleher's visit to the widow's burrow spread quickly. It was followed by the tangible proof. While others counted their dwindling resources, facing the rest of the winter with fear, Elspeth was secure. Her children were healthy, her food was unspoiled, her home was a haven. Constance Hartwell was the first to visit, not out of desperation, but out of a deep and respectful curiosity. She brought a gift of jam and sat with Elspeth for an hour, asking quiet, intelligent questions, her eyes taking in every detail of the construction. She understood. Others followed, first the women, then the men, their skepticism replaced by a grudging, then open, admiration. They came to see the place that had weathered the White Death, and they left with a new understanding of the land they lived on. That spring, 3 more families began digging into the hillsides on their own properties. Elspeth became their teacher. She did not hoard her knowledge. She gave it freely, explaining the principles of the north-facing slope, the clay barrier, the dry stacking technique, and the critical design of the earth flue. She taught them how to read the stone and listen to the soil. The structures they built, which became known throughout the territory as Corrigan houses, were a revolution in frontier architecture. They were warmer in the winter and, as it turned out, cooler in the summer than any log cabin, and they could be built with the materials of the land itself, earth, stone, and salvaged timber, requiring very little cash, which few homesteaders had. The worst property in the region, the one with the useless, shadowed hill, had become the source of the most valuable secret, a new way to live, not in opposition to the harsh land, but in partnership with it. Elspeth Corrigan lived in her hill house for the rest of her long life, raising her children and then her grandchildren within its warm, quiet walls. The house stood for over a century, a testament to the quiet innovator who had faced down skepticism and the fury of nature with little more than a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a principle she had learned at her father's knee. Long after the log cabins of her critics had rotted back into the soil, the sturdy stone walls of Elspeth's home remained, a permanent feature of the landscape, its sod roof covered in wildflowers each spring. The knowledge she shared became a part of the local wisdom, passed down through generations, a legacy of resilience carved not just from stone and earth, but from the profound and simple truth that the greatest shelter is not built against the world, but within it.